Hello, Professor Jim Albrecht here, and today we have made it to Toni Morrison's novel Sula. Uh, I would like to talk today about Sula Peace as a protagonist in the novel. In Sula, Morrison has created a heroine so unconventional in her attitudes and approach to life that readers may have a hard time understanding or sympathizing with Sula. Why is Morrison interested in creating this kind of protagonist who cultivates what the novel calls an experimental life? How can readers best understand why Sula has pursued the life and the mode of selfhood that she has? Now, Sula is not only a novel about a remarkably unconventional heroine, it's also about a friendship, Sula and Nels, about a community, the bottom, and about history, about the experience of being African American in the first half of the 20th century. To try to understand Sula, we need not only to consider her friendship with Nell, but also how her and Nell's lives are responses to the experiences of their mothers and Sula's grandmother. So how have Helene Wright, Eva Peace, and Hannah Peace attempted to deal with their situations as black women in the first half of the 20th century? And how do the successes or limits of their strategies for dealing with their circumstances provide a context for understanding Sula and Nell's friendship and Sula's unconventional approach to life? So I want to start with Helene Wright. This is a description, one of the first descriptions we get of her in the novel. Wiley Wright took his bride home to Medallion and put her in a lovely house with a brick porch and real lace curtains at the window. His long absences were quite bearable for Helene Wright. Helene Wright was an impressive woman, at least in Medallion she was. Heavy hair in a bun, dark eyes arched in perpetual query about other people's manners. A woman who won all social battles with presence and a conviction of the legitimacy of her authority. Since there was no Catholic church in Medallion then, she joined the most conservative black church and held sway. It was Helene Wright who never turned her head in church when latecomers arrived. Helene who introduced the giving of banquets of welcome to returning Negro veterans. She lost only one battle, the pronunciation of her name. The people in the bottom refused to say Helene. They called her Helen Wright and left it at that. Helene thought about the trip south with heavy misgiving, but decided that she had the best protection, her manner and her bearing, to which she would add a beautiful dress. Now, on this trip to the south, when Helene's grandmother has died, the train is hardly out of the station in Medallion before this very carefully constructed middle-class identity that she has constructed for herself to try to protect herself and give her some kind of dignity. Before that persona is exposed and punctured by a white train conductor who reprimands her for having walked through the whites-only train car to get to the train car for colored people. And when he confronts her and accosts her, Helene smiles at him. And she does this in front of several uniformed black soldiers and in front of Nell. And here's a description of Nell's reaction to this scene, which the novel tells us made a significant impact on Nell. Nell looked away from the flash of the pretty teeth to the other passengers. The two black soldiers who had been watching the scene with what appeared to be indifference now looked stricken. She felt both pleased and ashamed to see that these men, unlike her father, who worshipped his graceful, beautiful wife, were bubbling with a hatred for her mother that had not been there in the beginning, but that had been born with a dazzling smile. In the silence that preceded the train's heave, she looked deeply at the folds of her mother's dress. There in the fall of the heavy brown wool, she held her eyes. She could not risk letting them travel upward for fear of seeing that the hooks and eyes in the placket of the dress had come undone and exposed the custard-colored skin underneath. She stared at the hem, wanting to believe in its weight, but knowing that custard was all that it hid. If this tall, proud woman, this woman who was very particular about her friends, who slipped into church with an unequaled elegance, who could quell a roustabout with a look, if she were really custard, then there was a chance that Nell was, too. It was on that train shuffling toward Cincinnati, that she resolved to be on guard always. She wanted to make sure that no man ever looked at her that way, that no midnight eyes or marbled flesh would ever accost her and turn her into jelly. Late that night, after the fire was made, the cold supper eaten, the surface dust removed, Nell lay in bed, thinking of her trip. It had been an exhilarating trip, but a fearful one. She had been frightened of the soldiers' eyes on the train, the black wreath on the door, the custard pudding she believed lurked under her mother's heavy dress, the feel of the unknown streets and unknown people. But she had gone on a real trip, and now she was different. She got out of bed and lit the lamp to look in the mirror. There was her face, plain brown eyes, 3 braids, and the nose her mother hated. She looked for a long time, and suddenly a shiver ran through her. "I'm me," she whispered. "Me." Nell did not quite exactly know what she meant, but on the other hand, she knew exactly what she meant. "I'm me. I'm not their daughter. I'm not Nell. I'm me. Me." Each time she said the word me, there was a gathering in her, like power, like joy, like fear. Back in bed with her discovery, she stared out the window at the dark leaves of the horse chestnut. "Me," she murmured, and then, sinking deeper into the quilts, I want to be wonderful. Oh, Jesus, make me wonderful." The many experiences of her trip crowded in on her. She slept. It was the last as well as the first time she was ever to leave Medallion. Okay, I want to focus on a couple different aspects of Nell's responses here. First of all, this is a realization of her mother's vulnerability, of her parents' vulnerability, that behind her respectable dress, behind Helen's respectable dress, is custard, that her carefully constructed middle-class respectability can't protect her from the racism of the society or sexism of the society. And on the one hand, Nell takes a satisfaction in seeing her mother's vulnerability. I think because Helene has always been a very dominating and manipulating mother. But on the other hand, even as she sees her mother's vulnerability, Nell expresses a desire, a resolve, that she will never be vulnerable in that way. That she expresses a desire to have that same kind of security that her mother has, in this case, unsuccessfully sought. Secondly, she has a sense of liberation and an affirmation of her own independent identity. "I'm me," she says to herself, and she feels a sense of power and joy from this affirmation. But she can only express this sense of possibility in a rather vague way. Right? She says, "Make me wonderful. Jesus, make me wonderful." And then there's a very telling detail that this trip that has given Nell this sense of possibility is the one and only time in her life that she travels outside of the town of Medallion. So as you read on in the second half of the novel, think about what kind of insight this scene gives us into Nell's development in the novel, into the kind of self-realization that she pursues and perhaps attains. Now, by contrast, if Nell has grown up in Helene Wright's household where there's this striving for middle-class respectability, Sula has grown up in a very unconventional household shaped by the matriarchal figure of Eva Peace. And the Peace household and family, I think, Morrison uses to explore how complicated love and relationships can be between mothers and their children, and romantic and sexual love, especially when love and those relationships are stressed by the kind of marginalization and poverty that the people in a community like the Bottom face. So I've just given some bullet points here. Think about the series of things that we learn about Eva Peace and about Hannah in the first half of the novel. The various examples we get from their lives of a very complicated relation to love and to relationships with others. So we hear the story of how Eva saved Plum's life when he was a little boy, left town and returned 18 months later with one leg and money enough to maintain what the novel calls her house of many rooms, over which she is a kind of a creator and sovereign. We learn about how when Boy Boy, the father of Plum returns, Eva discovers the power of hating. The novel says, hating boy, she could get on with it and have the safety, the thrill, the consistency of that hatred as long as she wanted or needed it to define and strengthen her from routine vulnerabilities. It was hating him that kept her alive and happy. And then we hear about Hannah and her sexual life in the household. The novel writes, with the exception of Boy, those peace women loved all men. It was man love that Eva bequeathed to her daughters. Hannah simply refused to live without the attentions of a man, and after Recus's death had a steady sequence of lovers, mostly the husbands of her friends and neighbors. Seeing her step so easily into the pantry and emerge looking precisely as she did when she entered, only happier, taught Sula that sex was pleasant and frequent, but otherwise unremarkable. We have the scene where Eva burns Plum, a very disturbing and emotionally complicated action on her part, and that she later explains to Hannah in very interesting and complicated terms. And then later, when Hannah herself is burned, we see Eva jumping out the second-story window of the house to try to put out the flames and save Hannah. So we have a series of very complex scenes about love and relationship in the Peace family. Now I want to look at two scenes, one about Hannah and one about Hannah and Eva, that I think give us some context for understanding Sula. This is a scene when Sula is walking upstairs in the house and she overhears her mother, Hannah, talking with two other women about this complicated question of how mothers feel about their children, how parents feel about their children. So this is the conversation that Sula overhears. My Rudy minds his daddy. He just wild with me. Be glad when he growed and gone. Hannah smiled and said, shut your mouth. You love the ground he pee on. Sure I do, but he's still a pain. Can't help loving your own child, no matter what they do. Well, Hester grown now, and I can't say love is exactly what I feel. Sure you do. You love her, like I love Sula. I just don't like her. That's the difference. Guess so. Liking them is another thing. Sure, they different people, you know. She, Sula, only heard Hannah's words, and the pronouncement sent her flying upstairs. Now that's a scene that is referenced later in the novel, in a passage that we'll be looking at in a few minutes, as having made a profound impact on Sula. The second passage I want to look at here is a conversation when Hannah brings up this same issue with Eva, her mother, the question of mothers loving their children. Mama, did you ever love us? Now, Eva looked up across from her wagon at her daughter. Give me that again, flat out to fit my head. I mean, did you? You know, when we was little. Eva's hand moved snail-like down her thigh toward her stump, but stopped short of it to realign a pleat. No, I don't reckon I did, not the way you thinkin'. Oh well, I was just wonderin'. Hannah appeared to be through with the subject. And Eva wonderin' if I ever heard one. Eva was not through. Aw, Mama. Aw, Mama. Aw, Mama, you settin' here with your healthy-ass self and ax me did I love you? Them big old eyes in your head would have been 2 holes full of maggots if I hadn't. I didn't mean that, Mama. I know you fed us and all. I was talking about something else, like playing with us. Did you ever, you know, play with us? Play? Wasn't nobody playing in 1895. I'm talking about 1895, when I sat in that house 5 days with you and Pearl and Plum and 3 beats, you snake-eyed, ungrateful hussy. What would I look like leaping around that little old room playing with young'uns with 3 beats to my name? I know about them beats, Mama. You told us that 1,000,000 times. Yeah? Well, don't that count? Ain't that love? What you talking about, did I love you? Girl, I stayed alive for you. Can't you get that through your thick head? Or what is that between your ears, heifer? This is a very complicated scene. Eva Peace is a really fascinating figure, I think, of the complexity of love in this novel. She can be very mean, as she really is in some ways in this scene. And she's not in any way a conventional figure of maternal love. And yet she is also capable, the novel suggests, of extraordinary expressions of love, as evidenced in the mysterious story about how she lost her leg, which is hinted at in this scene as Hannah moves her hand down the plait of her dress toward her stump when she's asked this question by Hannah. And again, in the very complex plot line where she burns her son Plum, and the way that she explains that action to Hannah after the fact. So how does Morrison's insistence on the complex forms that love can take, as we see in a character like Eva Peace, how does that help shape the way that we as readers understand Sula and her behavior, for instance, in her friendship with Nell? Okay, I want to turn now to this question of the friendship between Sula and Nell and look at a few passages where the novel describes the source or the power of their attraction to each other. They were solitary little girls whose loneliness was so profound it intoxicated them and sent them stumbling into technicolored visions that always included a presence, a someone who, quite like the dreamer, shared the delight of the dream. When Nell, an only child, sat on the steps of her back porch, surrounded by the high silence of her mother's incredibly orderly house, she studied the poplars and fell easily into a picture of herself lying on a flowered bed, tangled in her own hair, waiting for some fiery prince. He approached but never quite arrived. But always, watching the dream along with her, were some smiling, sympathetic eyes. Someone as interested as she herself in the flow of her imagined hair, the thickness of the mattress of flowers, the voile sleeves that closed below her elbows in a gold-threaded cuffs. Similarly, Sula, also an only child, but wedged into a household of throbbing disorder, constantly awry with things, people, voices, and the slamming of doors, spent hours in the attic behind a roll of linoleum, galloping through her own mind on a gray and white horse, tasting sugar and smelling roses, in full view of a someone who shared both the taste and speed. So when they met, first in those chocolate halls and next through the ropes of the swing, they felt the ease and comfort of old friends, because each had discovered that they were neither white nor male, and that all freedom and triumph was forbidden to them. They had set about creating something else to be. In the safe harbor of each other's company, they could afford to abandon the ways of other people and concentrate on their own perceptions of things. When Mrs. Wright reminded Nell to pull her nose, she would do it enthusiastically, but without the least hope in the world. After she met Sula, Nell slid the clothespin under the blanket as soon as she got into the bed. And though there was still the hateful hot comb to suffer through each Saturday evening, its consequences, smooth hair, no longer interested her. Joined in mutual admiration, they watched each day as though it were a movie arranged for their amusement. Now, I want to focus on a few things here. First, that Sula and Nell are attracted in part because they are very different and they come from such different homes. But also, note the commonalities here. Morrison in part explains Sula and Nell's friendship and the type of selfhood that they develop in and through their friendship with each other, that is a response to their awareness both of racism and sexism. They discovered they were neither white nor male, right? And had set about creating something else to be, since freedom and triumph was forbidden to them. Their friendship is a harbor. It's described as a harbor, a space where they can seek some alternate type of self-realization. A place where they can create something else to be, is the way that the novel describes it here. And we see that Sula has a liberating effect on Nell, helping Nell break free of her mother's ambitions to change her nose and her hair. And last of all, I want to call your attention to that striking phrase that they view each day as though it were a movie arranged for their amusement. Well, how does this attitude of the young girls compared to more conventional ways of responding to the world? And how does this phrase in particular perhaps help us understand some other moments in the novel? And I'm thinking about Nell and Sula's reactions when Chicken Little dies and at his funeral, or Eva, her observation of Sula when Hannah gets burned and she sees Sula there watching. So those are some things to think about in the novel in relation to this initial description of Sula and Nell's friendship. I want to close by looking at two passages that suggest the different tracks that Nell and Sula are taking from this shared childhood friendship as part one of the novel moves into part two. So first we have Nell's marriage to Jude Green, and this is a description of Jude's motives or desires heading into his marriage with Nell. So it was rage and a determination to take on a man's role anyhow that made him press Nell about settling down. He needed some of his appetites filled, some posture of adulthood recognized, but mostly he wanted someone to care about his hurt, to care very deeply, deep enough to hold him, deep enough to rock him, deep enough to ask, "How you feel? You all right? Want some coffee?" The more he thought about marriage, the more attractive it became. Whatever his fortune, whatever the cut of his garment, there would always be the hem, the tuck and fold that hid his raveling edges, a someone sweet, industrious, and loyal to shore him up. And in return he would shelter her, love her, grow old with her. Without that he was a waiter hanging around a kitchen like a woman. With her he was the head of a household, pinned to an unsatisfactory job out of necessity. The two of them together would make one Jude. Now what I'd like you to think about here is, how are these gender roles that Jude and Nell are assuming as they marry, how are they shaped by the racism that the bottom community faces? And as you read on in the second half of the novel, how does Jude compare to other male figures in the novel, whether it's Shadrach, Boy, Plum, and the Deweys, all of whom we have met in the first half of the novel, or their character Ajax, who plays a prominent role in the second half of the novel. So if that's the path that Nell is on, Sula has a very different path. And when Nell gets married, Sula moves away from Medallion for 10 years. We hear about what she's done in those 10 years. And when she returns, this is the novel's description of her attitude toward life that she has developed and cultivated in her years away from Medallion. The people in the bottom's evidence against Sula was contrived, but their conclusions about her were not. Sula was distinctly different. Eva's arrogance and Hannah's self-indulgence merged in her, and with a twist that was all her own imagination, she lived out her days, exploring her own thoughts and emotions, giving them full rein, feeling no obligation to please anybody unless their pleasure pleased her. As willing to feel pain as to give pain, to feel pleasure as to give pleasure, hers was an experimental life, ever since her mother's remarks sent her flying up those stairs, ever since her one major feeling of responsibility had been exercised on the bank of a river with a closed place in the middle. The first experience taught her there was no other that you could count on. The second, that there was no self to count on either. She had no center, no speck around which to grow. She was completely free of ambition, with no affection for money, property, or things, no greed, no desire to command attention or compliments, no ego. For that reason, she felt no compulsion to verify herself, to be consistent with herself. She had clung to Nell as the closest thing to both an other and a self, only to discover that she and Nell were not one and the same thing. So, as you read on into part 2 of Sula, and as you see the kind of adult selves that Sula and Nell have become, how do you think the novel invites you to judge, to feel, and think about this approach to life that Sula has developed? Especially when you consider Sula's approach to life in relation to Sula and Nell's friendship and what happens with their friendship in the second half of the novel, Sula's confrontation with and her treatment of Eva, her grandmother, when she returns to Medallion, the way that the members of the bottom community judge Sula, Sula's approach to sex and her relations with men, Sula's relationship with Ajax, our final view of Sula in the novel, the fate that befalls the bottom community at the new River Road excavation site, and then Nell's discussion with Eva and her final realizations about Sula. So those are all parts of the second half of the novel that I hope the scenes that I've taken us through here will provide you a context for developing an interpretation of that second half of the novel and what kind of commentary ultimately Toni Morrison makes about these two remarkable women. They're really, in a way, co-protagonists, co-heroines of this novel, Nell and Sula. And I think you should be able to hear the echoes in our course on individualism in American literature, that Sula Peace is really a remarkable character. In my experience, one of the most remarkable characters in American literature. And you can see we've had to talk about a lot of other things to understand Sula. A lot of other characters in the novel, the other settings and contexts of the novel, and there's many things, of course, that we haven't even touched on in this little tour that I've taken you through on this lecture. So with those questions in mind, I wish you happy reading as you finish Toni Morrison's novel Sula, and as always, I look forward to hearing your own responses and opinions about this great book. Thanks so much.